Hello, brothers. We're back with Herzl, as I remember him, by Erwin Rosenberger, or Rosenberger. And Herzl, of course, is the founder of political Zionism. 13. On page 2 of Die Welt's first issue, boldly signed Dr. Theodor Herzl, appeared an announcement which astounded many readers and was received which with much shaking of heads. A strange fellow, said some. Now he wants to call a Congress, an assembly of Jews from all parts of the world. And for what purpose? To decide upon the best ways and means for creating a Jewish state. A Congress the like of which has never been seen. The man has most curious ideas. But watch, it will never come about, and if it does, it will disgrace itself and end in a miserable fiasco. Such was the forecast of enemies and doubters. Since the first days I worked with Herzl, I had heard him speak of the Zionist Congress, of his plan for a parliament of the dispersed children of Israel, which would hold periodic brief sessions. The first Congress was to meet in Munich in late August 1897, and Herzl was able to announce in issued number 1 of Die Welt, delegates have already been named from most of the countries of Europe, as well as from Asia and Africa, and the campaign to send people to the Congress has gotten off to a splendid start in the United States of America. How easily that reads, and yet how hard Herzl had to work before he could announce his results. What a multitude of letters he had sent off to the countries of Europe and other parts of the world. And he had to do it all himself, with no one else to lean on. Just as the original idea of convoking the Congress had been Herzl's alone, so too he assumed the entire burden of carrying it out. So, headquarters of the whole undertaking was his study at number 6 Burgas. The motor which powered it was his head, nor was it a noisy, clangorous motor. Day after day, in moments matched from his work for Die Welt, I saw him sitting quietly, writing the innumerable letters to future participants in the Congress. Some he wrote out himself, others he dictated to me. Herzl was moving methodically forward. To the 2 instruments he had already created, his pamphlet, The Jewish State, and his magazine, Die Welt, was to be added a third, the Congress. His mighty pen was to be reinforced by a parliamentary body which would serve as a bridge to actual deeds. He said to me once during these preparations for the Congress's time sequence is reversed. The universal rule is first the state exists and then its parliament is chosen. We do it the other way around. First the parliament is founded and then the state. Another time he said, we are partly anticipating the Jewish state by providing it now with a parliament. But these paradoxical elements did not trouble him at all. His point of view was a paradox is a paradox only until it becomes a reality, and then it often becomes a platitude. We are flying in the face of logic. A tangible fact is stronger than any logic. As soon as the Jewish parliament has become a fact, all dialectical objections will cease. Let us create that fact. Herzl's plan to call a Congress aroused concern among a good many Zionists. It was a risky business. Who could say if it would end in success or failure? Even Herzl was uneasy at times. though his purpose remained unshaken. In conversations with me, he occasionally remarked that the Congress was a gamble. Failure would damage the Zionist movement, give its enemies cause for malicious joy, and discredit the whole Jewish state idea. Would all the prospective delegates actually be able to keep the promises they had made in their letters to Herzl? When the time came, would they be able to make the rather lengthy trip to the Congress site? Rabbi S. Schaefer of Baltimore, W.I. Temkin, the rabbi and engineer from Yelizavetsgrad, Russia, Dr. Leon Walensky of Kremenchug, Russia, Dr. D. Alcalay, the lawyer from Belgrade, Professor Belkowski of Sofia, Adam Rosenberg of New York, Dr. Joseph Seligman of Stockholm, would they and all the others from near and far really take part? And if the Congress did take place, would its deliberations proceeding in the full light of publicity take a course that would fill us with pride? Or would irresponsible elements introduce a discordant note that would jar with the dignity and high purpose of the occasion and degrade the Jewish parliament in the eyes of the world? We all felt that the success or failure of the Congress would mean a great deal for the future of the Zionist. We already went over these photos, so whip past them. The Zionist movement. And we wished it well as fervently as our adversaries wished it ill. One of the goals which Herzl advanced in his program in the first issue of Die Welt was emigration of the Jewish masses to the land of their fathers. In Tsarist Russia at that time, there were nearly 6 million Jews, barely existing under the most wretched conditions, oppressed, deprived of all rights, and constantly threatened by the Damoclean sword of pogroms. The pogrom was an unofficial state institution. Whenever the Russian ruling class felt threatened by popular discontent or ferment of any sort, it diverted the people's fury in another direction, against the Jews. There the fury would burn itself out, and the regime could feel safe once again. In Romania, 300,000 Jews fared little better. In Galicia, then a province of Austria, some 800,000 Jews lived for the most part in abject poverty. And in various sections of Western and Central Europe, especially in the German-speaking parts of Austria, the Jews had a special function. Whenever an ambitious demagogue wished to launch a political career, he had only to inscribe a few anti-Semitic slogans on his banner, and he was assured of a popular following. Forgive me. When Herzl created the new Zionist movement and set about preparing for the Congress, he hoped that by returning to the land of their fathers, the Jewish masses could be rescued from this role of political scapegoat and from their life of misery. And now let us turn to a man who played a significant part in Herzl's life and in the Jewish state movement, a man who was Herzl's friend and collaborator. He was 10 years older than Herzl, was born in Budapest like the latter, and was also a noted writer, indeed one of even greater renown. Thick-set and shorter than Herzl, bearded like him, he radiated nobility of mind and had the power to capture an audience. His name was Max Nordau, and he published an article in Die Welt's second issue, dated June 11th, 1897, which produced a sensation. I need to turn this fan down because it's too loud. Much better. Much 14. Max Nordau's article was a sensation less because of its content, even though this did attract considerable attention, than because of the identity of its world-renowned author. Many could not believe their own eyes. Had a man like Nordau really gone over to the Zionist? Had he too taken up the cudgels for a Jewish state? Had he too taken up the cudgels for the Jewish state? Obviously, he had, quite publicly, in a lead article in issue number 2 of Die Welt, and he was to remain true in his allegiance to his friend Herzl through all the later phases of the Zionist movement. In his article, Nordau turned all his polemical skill against the chief rabbi of Vienna, Dr. Moritz Gutermann, who, after long hesitation, had finally come out against the Zionist concept in a pamphlet entitled National Judaism. Nordau's appearance in Die Welt had a powerful effect. That Gutermann had suffered a defeat was purely secondary. The sensational fact, and one which buoyed the spirits of all Zionists, was that a man of Nordau's stature had openly espoused the Jewish state idea. The importance of Nordau's act was heightened. The importance of Nordau's act was heightened by a particular circumstance which may be difficult for the modern reader to believe. At the time all this was happening, a man who favored the establishment of a Jewish state and considered it feasible was regarded by many people as quite simple crazy. Nor do I mean crazy in the sense the word is applied to an eccentric, to a queer bird, but in the normal medical sense, mentally ill, insane. Herzl himself was a victim of this prevalent attitude. At the very start, when he told his friends in Paris that he intended to work for the creation of a Jewish state, he knew from their shocked looks and from certain unmistakable remarks that they thought he had lost his mind. One woman friend burst into tears when she heard that Theodor Herzl had a Jewish state on the brain. Under the psychological pressure of his well-meaning friends in Paris, Herzl at times came close to doubting his own sanity. It took all his strength of mind to stand up under the suspicious or pitying looks and not succumb to the power of suggestion. He believed in himself and in the rationality of his idea, despite all the tears and admonitions. And he pursued his course. In Vienna, too, after he had moved there to assume a top editorial post on the new Free Press, he caught the same looks and hints. A very gifted man, indeed a man of genius, but unfortunately something is not quite right. You know, the business with the Jewish state. Then, all at once, Max Nordau made his appearance in Die Welt. The astonishment would not have been as great if he had been merely a well-known writer, but Nordau was noted for his alertness to anything which departed from normal standards of mental health. A doctor of medicine among his own attainments, he had in fact made a specialty of detecting aberrations in the people and the social trends of that time. And here was this same Nordau, the merciless critic, the experienced psychologist, the author of The Conventional Lies of Civilized Man, and other widely read books proclaiming almost defiantly his adherence to the Jewish state. The article in Die Welt with which he moved into the front ranks of the movement was, in effect, a medical certificate attesting that the Zionists were sound of mind and were not pursuing a hopeless phantom. Herzl greatly valued Nordau's adherence to the Jewish state idea and was gratified at winning such an ally. I cannot cite any specific words of his to prove this, but I recall his making frequent remarks on the subject. Not only did he recognize that the name Max Nordau would lend new prestige to the Zionist cause, He also felt strengthened by the knowledge that he had in Nordahl an active and valuable collaborator. One minor detail from this period is interesting for what it reveals about Herzl. Before me is the original manuscript of Nordahl's article attacking Rabbi Gudeman. It contains some revisions in Herzl's handwriting. Nordahl was not in the habit of handling opponents with kid gloves. In the first line of his article, he dignified his victim with the latter's full title, the Chief Rabbi of Vienna, Herr Dr. M. Gudeman. And at the very end, he referred to the Chief Rabbi, Dr. M. Gudeman. But with that, the amenities were at an end. Throughout the rest of the article, Nordahl wrote simply, Herr Gudeman. To Herzl, however, Herr Gudeman sounded too abrupt. The elderly gentleman, he was then 62, with the white prophet's beard, who had shown in the past his personal sympathy for Herzl, was surely entitled to a more respectful form of address. So Herzl took his pencil and in each instance placed a doctor after the Herr. It was only 2 letters, but it represented a small plaster for the wounds which Nordahl had inflicted. Nordahl assigned his name simply Max Nordahl, but here too Herzl prefixed a doctor, obviously on the assumption that adding the title would lend the article greater authority in the eyes of its readers. Herzl would have shrunk from making any more extensive changes in the manuscript. He had always been profoundly aware of Nordahl's greatness, literary and otherwise, and he paid him the tribute of leaving his manuscripts intact, insofar as possible. For that matter, any major editorial changes would surely have brought a protest from the author, and Nordahl could protest vigorously indeed when the occasion required. But above all, Herzl never forgot that his friend Nordahl had stood by him during those dark days in Paris when most others saw in the Jewish state idea only the product of a sick mind. 15. Besides Herzl and myself, Die Welt had a third editor, Dr. Saul Raphael Landau, a lawyer by profession and about 30 years of age. He was well built and approximately Herzl's height. He was good looking with a short brown goatee. At the very bottom of the last page of the magazine were the words, Publisher Paul Naschauer, Executive Editor Dr. S.R. Landau. There was nothing whatever to indicate that the moving spirit of the entire undertaking was actually Herzl. Landau's editorial role at Die Welt was not an impressive one. He devoted very little time to the day-to-day chores of putting out the magazine, and his visits to the print shop or our Rembrandtstrasse office were rare events. I never once saw him in Herzl's study, where most of our work was done. He contributed occasional articles and short items, but in general, his absence from the editorial board would not have made the slightest difference. Paul Naschauer, who was listed as publisher, was Herzl's brother-in-law. A pleasant, middle-aged man, he was slim, blond, of medium height, and a stylish dresser. His relations with Herzl were warm, and it was apparent that he freely acknowledged the latter's superiority as something which did honor to all those linked to him by blood or marriage. It was my understanding that Naschauer was then a leading figure at the Vienna Fruit and Produce Exchange and a very wealthy man. He undoubtedly played some part in supporting Die Welt. He visited our Rembrandtstrasse office quite often and was always unaffectedly cordial. With none of the airs of a publisher, He was interested in the magazine's affairs, but never interfered in editorial or administrative matters. Nassauer was much better educated and more widely read than the average businessman. Once at our office, he made a chance reference to the so-called basic laws, which provided the juridical foundation of certain states. Dr. Landau, who happened to be present, promptly asked, in an offensively pedagogical manner, "Do you know our basic law? Do you know what it is?" Whereupon Nassauer good-humoredly proceeded to quote the verbatim text of the statute like a well-prepared law student in the examination hall. On June 17, when I arrived at Herzl's house as usual, he asked me, "Have you read yesterday's Ostdeutsche Rundschau?" He asked the question very matter-of-factly as he rummaged among some papers on his desk. I replied that I hadn't. "Read it," he said, still quite imperturbable. "You will find in it the first lead article that it has ever been your lot to inspire." That was all, and the subject was never referred to again. Full of curiosity as to what I might have to do with the lead article, I obtained a copy of the Rundschau, a Viennese paper, during the course of the day. My questions were quickly answered. The article dealt with a short item I had written for the week column in the second issue of Die Welt. In it, I had criticized the excessive preoccupation of Austria's German and Czech-speaking Jews with trifling issues of domestic politics, which caused them to neglect the most vital Jewish problems. I closed with the words, "Of course the Jews have no other troubles. Of what importance is the ghetto, which is rising like a threatening cloud on the Austrian horizon? Of what importance is the misery of our Galician, Romanian, and Russian brothers who are rotting in poverty?" My remarks had outraged the anti-Semitic Ostdeutsche Rundschau. However, its attack was directed less at Die Welt than at the great Viennese daily, the New Free Press. Herzl was, of course, not only editor-in-chief of the Zionist Welt, but also a member of the press's editorial staff. The Rundschau was exploiting this fact to discredit the press by making it responsible for statements and opinions which appeared in Die Welt. My brief item was actually only a pretext, for other Viennese papers had previously used the same tactics against the press. Herzl had been aware from the start that the item in question might have repercussions. When I originally showed it to him, he had read it carefully and then hesitated. "That's a dangerous item." "It represents our viewpoint," I replied. He hesitated again, and then suddenly, as though brushing aside his misgivings, threw it on the pile of manuscripts destined for the printer. The outcome must have been most painful to Herzl, yet he never showed the slightest trace of anger or irritation afterward. It was as though he accepted such episodes with philosophical resignation, and, moreover, had said to himself, "I read the item, accepted it, printed it, the responsibility is mine." A quarter of a century later, when Herzl's diaries were published, I learned that the Ostdeutsche Rundschau's article had led to an exchange of words with Morris Benedict, one of the publishers of the New Free Press. Benedict had declared Die Welt is a source of great embarrassment to us. It would be better if it ceased publication, to which Herzl had replied, "That is out of the question." I do not see how anyone who had once looked into Herzl's brown eyes could ever forget them. Roundish rather than oval, they were framed by finely formed lids and somewhat deep set. When one spoke with Herzl, it was his eyes above all that fixed one's attention. Not that he made any deliberate attempt to hypnotize his listeners. In his daily relations with other people, he was perfectly natural and unaffected. Rather, if one sometimes glimpsed a radiance in his eye, which was out of the ordinary, it was a reflection of his personality, which was surely out of the ordinary. The magnetic quality of his eyes stemmed from the spiritual life which could be read so clearly in them. Again and again the thought occurred to one, the noblest East speaks out of these eyes. Which biblical prophet, which ancient prince may it have been who bore these same lineaments? After innumerable generations, the very image of a man long vanished springs suddenly from the bosom of a nation, and flames which blazed millennia ago once again in the eye of a descendant glow once again in the eye of a descendant. Herzl's eyes were highly expressive. Above all, they were earnest and alert. They seemed to observe and comprehend everything, to peer into the secret place of men's souls. Who can say how many people may have come to Herzl with some dishonest intention, only to abandon their schemes after confronting those eyes, which penetrated all masks and all deception? Each of Herzl's moods found its appropriate and engaging expression in his eyes. He was never given to exaggerated facial contortions. Only once did I ever see him grimace. In order to make his 3 children laugh for a photograph, he made a funny face. His eyes could be solemn. They could be gay and roguish. They could flash with righteous anger. And they could be tender when he caressed one of his children. He had a curious way of looking at a friend as he shook hands to take leave. He would lower his head slightly, rolling his eyes with a wordlessly eloquent expression, as though exchanging a silent pledge. Do I keep going? We're only at 28 minutes, so I probably should. 16. With the summer heat approaching, Herzl announced one day, "We're leaving for the country soon." His wife and children, it appeared, would go to Bad Ischl together with his parents, or his parnets. I'm going to guess it's parents, while he himself would stay in Reichenau for some time. He added that he hoped the editorial routine of the Die Welt would proceed without a hitch during his absence. It was not welcome news. The thought that Herzl might leave Vienna had not even occurred to me. However, I felt by now sufficiently familiar with my editorial duties to carry on with a measure of autonomy. I had also learned enough about Herzl's ideas and wishes so that I had no fear of taking some action that would be grossly at variance with his thinking. Of course, Die Welt had another editor, Dr. Landau, but he was more or less automatically left out of consideration. Herzl had more confidence in me than in him, and for my part, I had the feeling that in any emergency I could count on myself better than on him. As far as Landau himself was concerned, he was only too willing to agree to an arrangement which lifted the responsibility from his shoulders and left him more time for other pursuits. In any event, I was comforted by the thought that Reichenau was only an hour and a half from Vienna by train, so that it would not be difficult to contact Herzl in case of need. The Upper Austrian spa, Bad Ischl, where Herzl's family were to spend their holidays, was known for attracting a large number of Jewish guests from Austria, Hungary, and other countries. Viennese Jews were particularly well represented. Ischl was popular less for the curative powers of its salt and sulfur springs than for its salubrious climate and for the pleasure of being among friends. As soon as Herzl's family had left for Ischl, Die Welt's editorial offices were moved from his home to the official headquarters at number 11 Rembrandtstrasse. Herzl's family was going away for a holiday, but he had no intention of abandoning himself to sweet idleness in the country. A great deal of work awaits me at Reichenau, he told me. He said to me, preparations for the Congress, completing the welcoming speech, assigning the reports, and letters. It was a sacrifice for Herzl to separate himself from his family. Had his mind not been so filled with plans for the Congress and other Zionist matters, he would never have spent the vacation weeks given him by the new free press away from those close dear to him, his colleagues on the press used the time to loaf a bit and rest their weary brains after the year's exertions. But Herzl felt he could not permit himself anything like that. Several times, speaking of the Zionist movement, he had said to me, if I should stop working today, the whole apparatus would come to a standstill. And what he said was true. He had invented the apparatus, he had constructed it, and now he serviced it, a master mechanic who no one could replace. Who knows what might have happened if, at that stage in the development of Zionism, he had turned away from it. Herzl had a very cogent reason for spending these weeks of concentrated work in Reichenau rather than Vienna. He wanted to put ample distance between himself and the new free press. Had he remained in the city, he would have run the constant risk, even though he was on vacation, of being suddenly pressed into service by one of the editors to write some absolutely vital, frightfully urgent article. For there is no one quite so ruthless as a newspaper editor in quest of a story. In Reichenau hoped open and concealed of the Congress, who would gladly have strangled it in the cradle, were already stirring in Jewish circles, and defensive measures were necessary. Once at the Rembrandtstrasse, Herzl said to me, God protect the Congress against the Jews. There will be no need to protect it against the anti Semites. There existed a preparatory commission for the Congress, but like most of the commissions and committees which had sprung up around Herzl, it was more decorative than effective. It was essentially out of modesty that Herzl permitted the formation of these bodies, though he had himself created everything of real importance. He was perfectly willing to see some of the reflected glory of his own achievements fall upon his associates. Occasionally, there were little palace revolutions, with the preparatory commission protesting against Herzl's allegedly aristocratic and arbitrary behavior. You can't see it? You can't see it. Where the hell? Then he would have to calm the teapot tempest by giving the rebels new assurances of the vital role they would play in the success of the undertaking. Far more serious than these petty uprisings, however, was the increasing opposition to Herzl's Zionist activities, which was developing in the executive offices of the new free press. What was involved here was his very material existence and the welfare of his family. He was having sharper and sharper exchanges with his employers, who demanded that he sever his connections with Die Welt and the Zionist movement. From day to day, he expected the final break, which would mean either resignation or dismissal. If this happened, Herzl would lose more than just his livelihood. He would also forfeit a journalistic and literary position, which it had taken years of hard work to achieve. A top ranking editorial post, which was at once a position of power and a pinnacle of literary eminence. It was a truly agonizing inner conflict. For which should he decide, Die Welt or the great Viennese daily? Among intimate friends, Herzl spoke frankly of this painful dilemma, with the result that the whole affair inevitably became common knowledge. Through the indiscretion of a young relative of Herzl's wife, I had learned roughly what his financial situation was. It was a comfortable one. Nevertheless, it was obvious that if he lost his position with the new free press, he would scarcely be able to maintain his family's previous scale of living, even though this had been well within the bounds of moderation. And yet it should not be thought that Herzl was visibly tottering under the weight of his inner struggle. He bore his troubles fatalistically, prepared for both a favorable and an unfavorable outcome. Basically an optimist by temperament, he had the capacity to drive worries from his head, at least temporarily when the situation required it. And that's going to be it for now. There's Herzl.